You stand in the lower workshop of a half-timbered building in a cloth-making town of the year 1350, where the first grey light of a mild spring morning filters through a high, narrow window whose small panes are thick and greenish, coating the room in a watery dimness that clings to every surface without haste. The great wooden vat, nearly 5 feet across and banded with iron straps, holds a deep pool of aged urine that has been collected from the town's households over the preceding weeks, a liquid that now sits perfectly still with a surface like old amber glass. Its faint warmth rising from the fermentation of the ammonia within and meeting the cooler air in slow, invisible curls. The fuller's stomping board, a thick plank of smoothed oak with 2 raised cleats to catch the cloth, leans against the vat's rim at a restful angle, its grain darkened by countless soakings, while along the walls rest bolts of raw wool cloth waiting to be cleansed and thickened, their fibers still carrying the oily lanolin of the sheep and the dust of the weaving shed. Above the vat, the floorboards of the merchant's meeting room form a low ceiling crossed by heavy beams from which a few strands of old cobweb hang motionless, and the first faint scuffs of early arrivals drift down as a tentative, muffled tapping that blends with the silence rather than breaking it, a sound as gentle as the cycling of the building's old timbers. The air carries the smell of the urine vat mixed with the dry scent of wool and the cool stone of the foundation, a smell that is not sharp but mellowed by months of daily use. And as you wait there in the gathering light, the room holds its breath around you like a thing accustomed to long, slow hours. The building itself stands on a narrow cobbled lane that slopes gently toward the river, its upper stories jutting out over the street in the fashion of the time, with plastered walls whose lime wash has faded to a quiet buff color and dark timber framing that shows the slight warp of centuries. The workshop occupies the ground floor, a space of packed earth and flagstones worn smooth by the passage of fullers and their assistants over countless seasons. And despite the open door at the back that leads to a small yard, the air inside remains motionless, held in place by the thick walls and the weight of the guild hall above. Nothing in the room moves except the light itself, as dawn strengthens by increments too fine to measure. A pale edge creeps across the top of the vat and slides down the iron bands before touching the floor with a diffused glow that reveals the texture of the wood grain, the nicks on the stomping board, and the fine layer of dust that coats the resting bolts of cloth. The silence is not empty, but populated by tiny sounds that have no start or finish, a gentle creak of a beam adjusting its load, a faraway rooster muffled by walls and distance, the soft gurgle of the vat's contents settling into complete stillness, as if the liquid itself were exhaling. You can feel the coolness of the morning on your cheeks, while your feet, still on the threshold, sense the retained warmth of the trampled earth that never fully gives up the heat of the previous day, a mild reminder that this room has a memory of its own. The vat dominates the space by its sheer size and the deep color of its contents, a brownish amber that shifts slightly toward gold wherever the weak light touches it, and you might notice how the surface holds no reflections except for the stripe of the window, a warped rectangle of lighter hue that sits motionless amid the darker edges. Around the rim, a dark tide line marks the level where the liquid most often rests, and below that the wood has been saturated so thoroughly that it gleams with a permanent dampness that never dries even in the hottest summer. The iron bands, forged with a slight flare at the rivets, show streaks of pale orange rust that have bled a faint stain onto the surrounding oak, and in one place, a small drip of the urine has dried and left a crystalline residue that catches the light like fine salt. Nothing about the vat suggests urgency. It is a vessel of waiting, a container for a process that cannot be hurried, and the cloth that will soon enter it lies folded nearby in rolls that still smell of the weaver's workshop, a dry, grassy scent that blends with the ammoniated air to create a bouquet that is unique to this one room in this one time. A smell that will be gone from the world before long, but that lingers now as a constant, unchanging presence. Overhead, the guild hall begins to stir with the first deliberate movements of the morning. You hear a heavy door open somewhere above, and then a measured tread on the staircase that connects the upper floor to the street. A tread that pauses after every few steps, as if the person climbing is either old or carrying something awkward. The floorboards transmit these sounds with a clarity that turns each footfall into a soft, distinct thud, followed by a brief vibration that travels through the beams and makes the cobweb near the vat sway once, twice, and then falls still. The guild members are arriving for their regular meeting, a gathering that takes place on the first Wednesday of each month to discuss the regulation of cloth measures and the town's trading seals, matters that have been debated in this same room above for as long as anyone can remember, with the same slow formality and the same pauses for thought between sentences. Their presence adds a new layer to the room below, a sense of occupancy that presses down through the ceiling and mingles with the quietude of the workshop. And as you listen, you can almost separate the different footfalls from one another. The heavy, deliberate stride of the guildmaster with his walking stick, the quicker, lighter steps of the younger merchants who have not yet gained the slow patience of their elders, the dragging left foot of the scribe who hurt his knee in a riding accident years ago, and the soft shuffle of the man who carries the elegant disk. These sounds are so predictable and so steady that after a while they become part of the stillness, another texture in the fabric of calm that wraps the morning. The light changes with the same unhurried rhythm. The window, set high to capture the first and last rays of the day, faces east, and as the sun lifts above the rooftops, the grey-green dimness begins to separate into colors. The amber of the vat deepens, the wool bolts reveal their natural brownish-cream hue, and the dark stains on the stomping board show as shades of walnut and char. The dust motes that had been invisible now appear as a slow drift of tiny specks suspended in the shaft of sunlight, their movement so lazy that you can follow one from the window all the way down to the floor without ever seeing it hurry. It wavers, pauses as if reconsidering its path, and continues downward in a straight line that seems governed by a clock far slower than any human one. The shaft itself lands on the edge of the vat and paints a golden oval on the dark wood, and within that oval the grain of the oak becomes vivid, each ring and knot distinct as a fingerprint, the surface worn smooth by the fuller's hands gripping that exact spot day after day. Nothing about the scene invites action. You might lean against the wall and feel the cool plaster through your sleeve, or you might simply stand in the middle of the room and let your breathing match the long, slow intervals between the sounds from above, intervals that stretch and contract like a sleeper's breath. The fuller has not yet arrived, but the workshop holds the imprint of his daily routine so strongly that his absence feels like a pause in a melody rather than a silence. His apron hangs on a peg by the door, a thick leather garment darkened along the front where countless splashes have soaked in and dried, and its shape still holds the curve of his shoulders, a ghost of his presence that waits for him to fill it again. Beside it, a pair of wooden pattens rest upside down on the floor, their soles caked with dried mud from the yard, and a small bench holds a clay cup and a covered pot of ale left from the evening before. Every object in the room is placed with the carelessness of long familiarity, and you can sense that if the fuller were to enter now, he would move among these things without looking, his body knowing the distance from the door to the vat, from the vat to the stomping board, from the board to the stacked cloth, by a memory stored in his feet and his hands, rather than in any conscious thought. The workshop is not a stage waiting for a performance, but a quiet instrument waiting for a player who will come in his own time. And in the meantime, the room maintains its composure, undisturbed by the few minutes that separate 1 hour from the next. Outside, the town is waking with the same gradual tempo. The lane beyond the workshop door is still in shadow, the upper stories of the opposite houses blocking the direct sun until mid-morning, and the sound of the first cart on the cobbles is a distant rumble that might be confused with thunder if the sky were not clear. A woman's voice calls out a name somewhere down the street, a single utterance that hangs in the air and fades without an answer, and then the rattle of a shutter being opened follows, a wooden clack that echoes briefly and is swallowed by the thickness of the walls. The town's sounds reach the workshop as a muted version of themselves, filtered through timber and plaster until they lose their edges and become a gentle ambient murmur, a background that underscores the silence rather than breaking it. Even the birds that nest in the eaves, sparrows mostly, do not sing, but only rustle from time to time, a soft scrabbling of tiny claws on the roof tiles that lasts a few seconds and then stops, leaving the silence slightly deeper than before. You are aware of the town as you might be aware of a slow-moving river from a bank, present, continuous, but never demanding your attention. Inside, the vat continues to hold its stillness with an almost sentient patience. The urine, stored in great clay urns before being poured into the vat, has been fermenting for weeks. A process that transforms the nitrogenous waste into ammonium carbonate, the active agent that will dissolve the grease in the raw wool, and this chemical work goes on invisibly, releasing its gentle warmth and its subtle sharpness without any visible sign. If you were to place your hand just above the surface, you would feel a breath of warmth no hotter than a sun-warmed stone, and a slight prickling in your nostrils from the ammonia vapor, a sensation that fades into the background after a minute or two as your senses adapt. The liquid itself is not repulsive, but strangely clean-looking, despite its origin, the fermentation having killed the bacteria and broken down the solids into a thin, amber fluid that looks almost drinkable, though of course nobody would mistake it for anything but what it is. The fuller would say that a vat is ready when it no longer smells of chamber pots, but as something sharper and purer, like a stable that has been scrubbed with lye, and this vat has reached that stage, the smell now a fixed part of the room's identity. The beams overhead, blackened by centuries of smoke from the central hearth that once stood in the guild hall above, run the length of the ceiling in parallel lines that draw the eye toward the far wall where the staircase rises. Their surfaces are rough with adze marks, each cut slightly angled and overlapping, the work of a carpenter whose name is long forgotten, but whose hand remains in the wood as a pattern of shallow gouges. In one corner a mouse has nibbled a small hole at the base of the wall, and the hole is ringed with dark greasy stains where countless little bodies have squeezed through, a sign of life so small and unobtrusive that it would escape notice unless you were looking at the room with the same slow attention that the room itself bestows on everything within it. The floor, a mix of packed earth and stone flags where the fuller walks most often, has hollows and hummocks that have been shaped by feet over the decades, a topography of habit that would make anyone new to the space strip if they move too quickly, though nobody ever moves quickly here. As the first hour of the morning dissolves into the next, the guild above reaches its full attendance. You can now hear a low murmur of voices, not words, but the rise and fall of conversation, a sound like bees in a distant hive, and the scraping of chair legs on floorboards as the members settle around the long table. This table, which you cannot see but can imagine from the sound of things placed on it, is a heavy oaken board supported by trestles, scarred by candle burns and ink stains, and around it sit men in woolen tunics and hoods, their faces weathered from travel and their hands stained with the dye that tells their trade. They will talk for hours about the permitted width of a broadcloth, the proper weight of a sealed bolt, the tax on woad from the southern ports, and their talk will be so slow and so filled with repetition that it becomes a kind of lullaby, a human drone that seeps through the floor and wraps itself around the silent vat and the waiting cloth and the lingering darkness in the corners. But that is still to come. For now, there is only the assembling, the quiet convenience of men who have done this many times before, and below, the fuller's arrival is now imminent. A soft footstep on the yard stones, a hand on the latch, and the first creak of the workshop door beginning its slow inward swing. The fuller, a man of middle years whose frame carries the settled weight of a life spent standing over vats and stretching cloth on tenterframes, pauses in the open doorway with his bundle of undyed wool folded over his arm, and for a long moment he simply looks into the workshop as one might look into a familiar room after a short absence, not searching for anything but letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, and his ears register the unchanged sounds of the place. His leather boots, soft from years of oiling and wear, make no sound on the threshold, and the bundle of cloth, a coarse brownish wool that still holds the crimp of the sheep and the faint, grassy smell of the weaving shed, rests against his coarse linen tunic with the comfortable drape of something that has been carried many times before. The workshop greets him with its usual stillness, the great wooden vat glowing amber in the filtered light, the stomping board leaning exactly where he left it the evening before, his apron hanging on the peg, and the clay cup and covered pot of ale still on the small bench. He notes these things with a single slow glance that requires no turning of the head, and then he steps inside, the heavy door swinging shut behind him under its own weight, with a low, soft thud that is not so much a noise as a closing of the barrier between the outside light quiet heat. He crosses the flagstones without hurry, each footfall a solid, patient placement of leather on stone, and the sound of his steps is no louder or more urgent then the occasional drip of moisture from the high window ledge where condensation collects against the cool glass and runs down in thin, intermittent beads. A sound so regular that it blends into the general texture of the room and can only be noticed when it stops. The bundle of cloth is transferred from his arm to a low trestle table that stands near the vat, its surface worn into a shallow concave by the repeated rubbing of folded fabrics, and he unfolds the cloth just enough to spread it loosely across the tabletop, the wool falling open with a dry, rustling sigh that fills the space between the vat and the wall and then subsides into a settled quiet. His hands, thickened across the knuckles and stained a permanent faint brown from years of working with the urine and the dyed wool, move with an unhurried accuracy that comes from having performed these actions thousands of times, and he arranges the fabric so that its long selvage lies closest to the vat, ready to be lifted and fed into the liquid, a small preparation that asks for no thought but simply occupies the interval before the work begins. Now he turns to the vat itself and places his right hand, palm down, just above the surface of the amber liquid, feeling the gentle warmth that rises from it, a warmth that is not hot but tepid, like water left in a sun-warmed bowl. And this tells him that the fermentation is active and the ammonia strong enough to dissolve the grease in the raw wool. He dips his fingers slowly, letting them break the still surface without a splash, and the liquid closes over his knuckles with a soft, inward flow that is warmer than the air and carries a slight tickle of ammonia up into his nostrils. A sharp but clean scent that has been part of his life for so long that he barely registers it as anything more than the ordinary smell of work. He holds his fingers there for a count of perhaps 10, feeling the temperature with a patience that measures nothing in particular, and then withdraws them, watching the drips fall back into the vat in thin amber rivulets that make small fleeting circles on the surface before merging into the general stillness. The wetness on his hand dries quickly, leaving a slight tightening film on his skin that will stay with him all day, a condition he no longer notices. He nods once, a small private gesture that confirms what he already knew, that the vat is ready and the cloth can now be wetted and worked, and he turns back to the trestle table, gathering the fabric in both arms with a careful, even grip that distributes the weight and keeps the folds from dragging on the floor. The cloth is heavy, perhaps 3 yards of the coarse wool that has been spun and woven by the widows who work the looms on the upper lane, and it hangs from his arms in loose loops as he steps to the vat's rim, leaning forward just enough to bring the first fold of the wool into contact with the amber liquid. The fabric touches the surface with a delicate sucking sound, a soft pronunciation of moisture meeting fiber, and the liquid begins to wick into the wool at once, darkening the cloth from a pale dusty brown to a deep wet umber in a gradual creep that spreads from the point of contact outward like a slow bloom. He watches this for a moment, not with curiosity, but with the satisfaction of a man who knows his materials, and then he lowers the rest of the bundle in a series of slow, even movements that submerge the wool. The cloth disappears beneath the surface with a gentle swallowing sound, the liquid closing over it without resistance, and the fuller uses both hands now to push the fabric down, his arms submerged to the elbows in the amber warmth as he works the wool under the surface, spreading it across the bottom of the vat so that it lies in an even layer, every fold touching the wooden staves and every fold equally exposed to the ammonia that will begin to dissolve its grease. The urine, displaced by the volume of the cloth, rises slightly against the vat's sides and laps at the tide line with a soft, rhythmic motion that is less a wave than a slow, silent breathing, and then it settles again as the cloth absorbs more of the liquid and the bulk of the wool sinks into a compact mass under its own weight. The fuller pulls his arms out and shakes the excess liquid from his hands with a few quick, practiced flicks that scatter small droplets across the flagstones where they land and dry in seconds. And then he reaches for the stomping board, which leans ready at the vat's rim, its grain dark and slick from 1,000 prior soakings. He picks up the board with both hands, feeling its familiar weight and the slight spring of the yoke where the cleats have been worn at the edges, and eases it into the vat at an angle so that the bottom edge enters first, sliding under the cloth with a submerged hollow thump that travels through the liquid and makes the surface quiver once. A single circular ripple that expands from the board to the iron bands and dies against them without echo. The cleats, two raised ridges of wood that run the length of the board's underside, press the wall down and hold it in place, and he checks their purchase by applying a gentle downward pressure and feeling the solid resistance of the cloth compressed between the board and the vat's bottom, a sensation transmitted up through his hands as a soft, springy give that tells him the cloth is secure and ready for the stomping. He adjusts the board's position by moving it an inch to the left, then back again to center, his arms moving with the fluid, unhurried precision of a craftsman who knows that a small adjustment now will make an hour of work smoother later. And when he is satisfied, he lets go of the board, leaving it floating in place with its top edge just above the surface, the urine lapping at the wood in silent, tiny motions. Now he steps away from the vat and sits on the low bench beside the door, not out of tiredness, but to perform the small ritual of removing his boots, a task he does with the same measured slowness as everything else, untying the leather thongs and working each boot off with a steady pull that releases his feet into the cooler air of the workshop. He sets the boots side by side under the peg where his apron hangs, lining them up without looking, and then he stands and rolls his woolen hose above his knees, the coarse brown knit stretching over his calves and bunching loosely at the joint, a practical arrangement that keeps the hose dry and free of the urine. His bare feet, pale and slightly misshapen from a lifetime of stomping, have soles that are tough and calloused, the skin thickened into a leathery pad that feels the cold of the flagstones, but not the discomfort that a softer foot would register, and he walks to the vat with a slight rolling gait that accommodates the shape of his arches, a gait that has become as natural as breathing. Beside the vat stands the small set of wooden steps, a simple construction of 3 treads nailed to 2 side rails, and he climbs them slowly, one hand reaching up to steady himself on a low roof beam that runs across the ceiling just above the vat, a beam that has been polished to a dark shine by the grip of countless fullers before him. His palm finds the familiar groove in the wood without searching, and his fingers curl around it with a secure, comfortable hold. From the top step he looks down into the vat, now filled with the cloth and the board and the still amber liquid that reflects a faint, distorted version of his own face, a rippling oval with dark eye holes and a blur where his beard should be, and then he lowers one foot, his right foot first, into the urine, breaking the surface with a quiet, inward rush of warmth that flows over his toes and the ball of his foot and climbs up his ankle, a sensation he knows so well that his body begins to relax even before the foot settles on the board. The liquid closes around his shin with a gentle, embracing pressure, and he follows with his left foot, shifting his weight from the step to the board in one smooth transition that makes the vat slosh once, a deep, hollow glug that rolls against the sides and then subsides as the fuller finds his balance, his hands still on the beam, his feet planted flat on the stomping board's cleats, his whole body now suspended in the warm, ammoniated bath. He stands there for a long, still moment, not yet stomping, just letting the warmth seep up through his soles and into his legs, a heat that loosens the muscles of his calves and the small of his back and seems to draw the morning's slight stiffness out through his skin, leaving behind a comfortable, heavy looseness that invites the rhythm of the work. His breathing deepens without his noticing, the way a sleeper's breathing deepens when sleep finally comes, and his shoulders drop away from his ears, settling into a position of restful readiness, as his body remembers the pattern of the stomping that it has performed so many times that it no longer needs the mind to guide it. The cloth beneath his feet feels like a thick, resilient cushion, slightly bumpy where the board's cleats press the wool into the curved bottom of the vat, and the liquid that fills the space around his ankles moves with a slow, sighing motion whenever he makes the smallest adjustment of his weight, a liquid whisper that is the only sound in the workshop now that his boots have ceased their footsteps and the door has stopped its swinging. Upstairs, the guild members have begun their meeting in earnest, and the fuller can hear the low, constant drone of their voices through the ceiling, not as words, but as a sustained murmur that rises and falls in gentle waves, a sound that has accompanied his stomping for so many years that it feels like part of the vat's own music, a background note that blends with the slosh and the creak and the soft, regular thump that will soon begin. He listens to this without really listening, his attention turned inward to the feel of the board under his feet and the temperature of the liquid and the readiness of the cloth, and then, after a final, settling breath, he lifts one foot, the left one, and begins the first slow press down into the wall, the stomping starting at last, with a quiet, deliberate beat that marks the true beginning of the day's long work. Now the Fuller begins the stomping, a rhythm that has no beginning and no end, but simply continues from the moment his left foot presses down into the cloth and the board until the day has worn itself into evening. A rhythm that is not so much a series of separate movements as it is one long, undulating motion, the lifting and pressing of heels in a slow alternation that recalls the way a pendulum swings without ever pausing at the top of its arc, each stroke flowing into the next with a seamless liquid transfer of hits of foot to foot. The first downward push sends a deep, hollow thump through the vat, a sound that is felt as much as heard, a vibration that travels up through the Fuller's legs and into his spine, and then the liquid answers with a quieter drawl as it reclaims its level, a wet, sucking sigh that rises and falls away before the second foot begins its descent, creating a regular sequence of thump and glug, that quickly becomes the workshop's own voice at 8, repetitive announcement that the Fuller guy are ahead. The sound of the stomping carries through the heavy air with a muted, rounded quality, the wooden vat and the thick walls absorbing the sharper edges of the noise and leaving only its soft, pulsing core, a sound that is not loud enough to startle a bird from the eaves, but is present everywhere in the room, filling the space between the flagstones and the beam ceiling with a continuous, gentle tremor. You might stand in the corner near the trestle table and feel the vibration through the soles of your own feet, a faint, regular buzzing that matches the beat of the Fuller's heels. Or you might place a hand on the wall and sense the same rhythm transmitted through the timber frame, a subtle, ongoing shiver that is the heartbeat of the building as long as the stomping continues. The sound does not vary, it remains constant in its deep pitch and its slow pace, a tempo that could be counted on the fingers of one hand in the space of a long breath, and this constancy makes it a sound that the ear can quickly stop noticing, a background presence that merges with the silence as thoroughly as the smell of the urine or the grey-green light from the window. The Fuller's feet move with the ease of long practice, his ankles flexing and his knees bending in a shallow, rhythmic dip that keeps his torso upright and still, a posture that has been taught by the vat itself over many years, and his hand remains on the overhead beam not out of need, but out of a comfortable habit, his fingers curled loosely around the wood with a grip that tightens and relaxes in time with his steps, a tiny, unconscious accompaniment to the larger motion of his legs. The board beneath him rocks slightly with each stomp, a gentle seesaw that presses the cleats down into the wool at the front and then at the back, and this rocking is so regular that it becomes a kind of cradle motion, a soft, predictable tilt and return that would lull a child to sleep if a child were ever brought into this quiet workshop. The cloth churns slowly in the vat, the fibers loosening their grip on the dirt, and the grease and the oily lanolin that the fermented urine works to dissolve with a chemistry that needs no force beyond this steady, unhurried pressure, a dissolution that happens molecule by molecule in the warm, amber bath, and the Fuller does not think about this chemistry, because he has no need to think about it, his body knowing the work, and his mind free to drift in the slow, wordless way that a mind drifts when the hands are busy with a familiar task. The floorboards above creak under the added weight of the merchants, who have now all taken their seats around the long table, and the sound of their settling falls into the same unhurried tempo as the stomping below. Not a counterpoint, but a parallel rhythm, a second pulse that moves through the ceiling beams and mingles with the thump of the vat to create a larger, slower pattern, something like the breathing of the entire building as it goes about its ordinary business on this mild spring morning. A heavier tread, the guildmaster's walking stick perhaps, crosses from one side of the room to the other with a series of distinct, spaced knocks, and then a chair scrapes back, settles, and is still, and the Fuller registers these sounds without naming them, his attention never leaving the feel of the cloth beneath his feet, which is growing gradually denser and smoother with each passing minute. The board's cleats press the wool with the same force each time, a force that is not heavy but is perfectly consistent, the weight of the Fuller's body distributed evenly across his soles so that no single spot receives too much pressure, and the fulling proceeds from selvage to selvage with an even, methodical thoroughness that has been learned through decades of doing. The daylight outside the window inches across the opposite wall with a slowness that makes the morning feel as if it might stretch forever, an endless pool of soft grey-green light and warm earthy smells, and the simple cyclical motion of feet in a vat, and the dust motes that drift in the shaft of sunlight seem to move in time with the stomping, pausing slightly at the moment of each thump before resuming their lazy downward spiral. The pattern of the stomping becomes, after a while, something that the Fuller's body obeys without any instruction, his feet lifting and falling in a steady sequence that is as automatic as the drawing of breath or the blinking of eyelids, and his mind, released from the need to supervise the work, wanders into a quiet, neutral space that is neither thinking nor sleeping, but a calm, suspended awareness of the present moment, a state in which the slosh of the vat and the creak of the beams and the murmur from a bowl exist as a single jigger. The vat's liquid responds to each stomp with a complex but predictable motion, rising against the side in a slow, thick wave that breaks into a soft, lapping ripple before traveling back across the surface to meet the next downward press, a motion that the Fuller can feel through the soles of his feet as a subtle, shifting resistance, the liquid pushing back against the board with a firm but yielding pressure that changes as the cloth thickens and the fibers tangle into felt. The urine, now cloudy with the dissolved grease and the loosened dirt from the wall, has lost some of its amber clarity, but gained a richer, deeper color, a brownish gold that looks almost like strong ale, and small bubbles of air that were trapped in the cloth rise slowly to the surface and pop with tiny wet sighs that punctuate the steady thump and glug without breaking its rhythm. The smell of ammonia rises more strongly now, sharpened by the motion of the stomping that releases new vapor from the liquid with every press, and this smell fills the nostrils and the throat with a clean, penetrating sensation that is not uncomfortable but simply present, a constant, astringent companion to the work. Through the floorboards, the guild's discussion continues in its low, droning way, the sound of many male voices overlapping and diverging in a pattern that never rises to excitement or argument, but remains a steady, conversational hum. A river of words that has been flowing since before the Fuller began his stomping, and will continue to flow until the midday meal. The Fuller hears this hum as he might hear rain on the roof or the distant turning of a mill wheel, a sound so familiar that it no longer carries meaning, only texture. Occasionally, a single word detaches itself from the general murmur and drops down into the workshop with a brief, clear emphasis, a word like seal or measure or fine, and then it is gone, reabsorbed into the drone, and the Fuller does not turn his head or pause his feet, because the word means nothing to the work of his body, which has its own language of pressure and resistance and warmth. The building, old and settled and heavy with the weight of its own timbers, creaks and ticks around him in a slow, constant counterpoint, its joints working against each other with the same infinite patience as the Fuller's joints, and the whole structure from the foundation stones to the roof ridge feels like a single, breathing organism, engaged in the long, slow process of a Wednesday morning. The Fuller's left knee, the one that has ached on damp days for the last 5 years, begins to send a faint signal of strain up through his thigh, a dull warmth that is not yet pain, but is a reminder that the body has its limits, and he responds to this without breaking rhythm by shifting his weight a fraction of an inch to the right, a tiny adjustment that transfers the main pressure to his stronger leg while his left foot continues to press down with the same even stroke, a change so slight that the boards drop did not right or with its nice. This is the wisdom of his craft, not a conscious decision but a bodily knowing that redistributes effort before strain becomes injury, and he has learned it from the vat itself over thousands of hours, the vat that is a strict but gentle teacher, never demanding more than can be given, but always asking for the same steady, unwavering patience. His breathing, which had deepened at the start of the stomping, now settles into a rhythm that matches his feet, a slow in and out that fills his belly and his chest with the ammoniated air and releases it without hurry. And this synchronization of breath with motion creates a kind of walking meditation, a state in which the boundary between the man and the work begins to blur. The light, meanwhile, continues its slow migration across the wall, and now a second shaft of sunlight, thinner and paler than the first, begins to appear through a smaller pane at the top of the window, a pane that is not greenish but clear and old, its surface rippled with the imperfections of medieval glass-making, and this second shaft catches the dust motes at a different angle, creating a double column of drifting particles that cross and recross each other in a silent, ghostly dance. The fuller does not see this because his eyes are half closed now, his lashes screening the light as he looks down at the board and the swirling liquid, but he feels the slight increase in warmth on the back of his neck, a pleasant touch of sun that joins the heat from the vat and makes the space within his tunic feel warm and drowsy, a cocoon of comfort in the cool morning room. The stomping continues, thump and glug, a sound that has been going on for so long now that it seems to have no origin, as if the vat and the fuller and the building itself were generating the rhythm together, a collaboration of wood and flesh and wool and time. Upstairs, the guildmaster has begun to read aloud from a parchment roll, and his voice, deeper and slower than the others, carries through the floor with a sing-song cadence that rises and falls on the ends of phrases. A voice that has read these same regulations so many times that the words have worn a groove in the air, and the merchants listen in silence now, their earlier murmurs still so that the only sounds from above are the reading voice and the occasional creak of a bench as a man shifts his weight. The fuller's feet answer this voice with their own steady beat, as if the two were parts of the same long, slow piece of music, a duet for voice and vat that has been performed in this building since before anyone can remember. And the cloth that is the silent subject of both the meeting and the stomping lies there between them, absorbing the regulation from above and the pressure from below with equal, passive patience. The minutes accumulate, one after another, in a slow pile like the dust on the window ledge, and the morning wears on toward its midpoint without anything happening that could be called an event, only the ongoing, peaceful continuity of a craft and a council, each sustaining the other in a quiet balance that is the ordinary miracle of this cloth-making town in the 14th century. The smell of the urine vat deepens as the stomping continues, its sharp ammonia edge lifting into the air with every downward press of the fuller's heels, a clean and penetrating scent that sharpens the atmosphere of the workshop without overwhelming it, because the nose, after the first few minutes, accepts the smell as a constant and folds it into the background of perception, a note that is simply the smell of work, the smell of cloth being made, as ordinary in this building as the dry scent of wool or the cool mineral exhalation of the stone. The fermentation that has been working in the liquid for weeks before it was poured into the vat has transformed the contents of the chamber pots into a chemistry that is no longer foul, but instead sharply clean. Like a stable after the horses have been turned out and the floor has been scrubbed with lye, and this cleanness is what the fuller breathes now. And a cleanness is what the fuller breathes now, an astringent vapor that seems to clear the sinuses and open the throat. A sensation that is not uncomfortable, but simply alert, a quiet companion to the rhythm of a fee. The ammonia rises from the surface in invisible curls, warm and slightly humid, and it carries with it a secondary note, the faint, distant earthiness of the aged urine from 100 different households, a smell that has been mellowed by time and by the action of the bacteria now long dead, leaving behind only the active compound that will dissolve the grease and the ghost of all those distant domestic mornings. The warmth of the vat is another constant, a steady heat that is neither hot nor cool, but precisely the temperature of a living body, which is why the fuller's legs when he first stepped in did not register a shock, but only a gentle, embracing familiarity, as if the vat were welcoming him back into a medium that his skin recognizes. This warmth rises from the liquid in a slow, ongoing exhalation, and it meets the cooler air of the workshop to form a thin, invisible layer of humidity that hovers just above the surface, a layer that the fuller's hands pass through each time he shifts his grip on the overhead beam, and that leaves a faint sheen of moisture on the wood of the vat's rim, a permanent dampness that never dries but simply remains. A dark line of saturation marks the border between the air and the active bath. The heat seeps upward through the soles of his feet, through the board's wet wood, and into the flesh of his arches and his heels, where it loosens the small muscles and the tendons, working on his legs the way the ammonia works on the wool, dissolving tension rather than grease, so that after the first hour of stomping his entire lower body feels heavy and warm and fluid, a pleasant, weighted looseness that makes the repetitive motion feel effortless, like walking through shallow, sun-heated water. The combination of the warmth and the smell creates an atmosphere in the workshop that is unlike any other space in the town, a microclimate of biology and chemistry that has persisted in this room for generations of fullers, each one adding his own body heat and his own labor to the vat. And the wooden walls have absorbed this atmosphere into their fibers, so that even on a cold morning with the door open and the wind blowing, the room still holds a faint trace of ammonia and the lingering gentle heat that clings to the beams and the floor. The fuller knows this room blindfolded by its smell and its temperature alone, and if he were to enter on a pitch-dark night, he would know exactly where the vat stood by the warmth on his face and where the window was by the thin, cool draught that slides across the plaster, a map of the senses that has been drawn into his body by years of daily attendance. He does not think about these things as he stomps. His mind is not on the smell or the heat, but on the sensation of the cloth beneath his feet, the gradually changing texture of the wool as it felts, a subtle, ongoing shift from a loose, open weave to a dense, matted fabric, a shift that he monitors through the soles of his feet with a concentration that is so deep it has become unconscious. The wool itself is releasing its own smells into the vat, the oily lanolin that has protected the sheep from rain and cold, now dissolving into the ammoniated liquid and giving off a faint, clean animal scent that mixes with the sharper ammonia note, rounding it out and making it something closer to the smell of wet sheep on a hillside, a smell that is not unpleasant but natural and old, a smell that has been known to shepherds and weavers and fullers since the first sheep was shorn. This lanolin, once dissolved, will be rinsed away in the next stage of the fulling, but for now it is part of the soup in the vat, and the fuller can detect its presence as a slight slickness on his skin when he lifts a foot from the board, a thin, greasy film that clings to his ankles and shins and then washes off again with the next plunge. A transient sensation that repeats every few seconds without ever becoming noteworthy. The dirt and dust of the weaving shed, the small particles of straw and chaff that were caught in the wool fibers, also release into the liquid, sinking slowly to the bottom of the vat, where they will collect as a fine brown sediment that the fuller will scrape out at the end of the week, a routine cleaning that is as much a part of the cycle as the stomping itself. The steam, though invisible, makes itself known by the way it softens the skin of the fuller's hands and face, a gentle, persistent moisturizing that leaves his cheeks feeling smooth and his lips slightly damp, and by the way it curls the edges of the parchment sheets that lie on the guild's table upstairs, a faint, distant effect that no one notices because the guild members have lived with it for years and accept a slight warp in their account rolls as part of the building's character. The humidity from the vat rises through the ceiling boards, passing through the gaps between the planks and the tiny cracks around the beam ends, to mingle with the dry air of the meeting room, and there it meets the other smells of the guild hall, the honest sweat of the merchants who have walked from their houses across town, the sharp tang of the iron gall ink in the scribe's pot, the mustiness of the old parchment that holds the records of the cloth, seals from years past entered, and the faint dusty scent of the charcoal brazier that warms mint now stand but stands corned and dampment. These separate scents, the ammoniated damp from below and the dry, papery smells from above, combine in the staircase that connects the two floors, a narrow, turning stair built into the thickness of the wall, and in that enclosed space the air has a distinctive quality that anyone who climbs the stairs will notice, without remarking, a blend of industry and administration that is the signature of this building. The scent of cloth being made and governed simultaneously, the fuller, breathing this air in its most concentrated form, does not find it strange or strong. His nose has been calibrated by the vat since his apprenticeship, and he could sleep beside the vat if he needed to, breathing the ammonia as calmly as a farmer breathes the smell of his barn. He of arrivers and thidi. Why of tune anti-sopping beguiled meats and the stomping has entered its final slow stage, and the combination of the warmth and the rhythm and the familiar smell pulls him into a doze that is light but restful. A small private restful, a doze from which he can wake instantly if the cloth needs turning. And these naps are as much a part of his day as the work itself, a small private rest that the guild members above will never know about because they are occupied with their talk of measures and sealed like The chemical work of the ammonia on the wool grease continues at its own molecular pace. a pace that has no relation to human time, and this is the reason the stomping must go on for so many hours, because the urine does not cut the grease instantly, but slowly, gradually, requiring the mechanical action of the feet and the board to agitate the cloth and bring fresh ammonia into contact with every fiber, over and over, until the wall has been stripped of its natural oils and the individual threads have begun to lock together into the dense, warm threads. The fuller can feel this locking through the soles of his feet as a gradual increase in resistance, the cloth beneath the board becoming springier and firmer with each passing hour, and he knows by this feeling when to turn the cloth so that the felting proceeds evenly, though he does not need to think about it consciously. His feet will tell his hands when the moment has come, a signal that travels up his legs and along his arms without the need for words or decisions. A direct line of communication between the cloth and the man that has been established by repetitent. The warmth from the vat spreads outward into the room and meets the cooler air near the door, where a thin draught sneaks under the gap and slides across the flagstones. And at this boundary the air develops a slight, gentle movement. A circulation that is too slow to feel on the skin, but that carries the ammoniated smell in a slow, rolling loop from the vat to the far wall and back again. A convection current driven by the heat of the fermentation and the coolness of the outside stone. This current, invisible and silent, moves the dust motes in the shaft of sunlight in a slow, counterclockwise drift, as if the whole workshop were a great, slow clock measuring time not in seconds, but in the long, easy breaths of the morning, and the dust particles, tiny flecks of wool and wood and dried mud from the floor, trace this circulation for hours, never settling, never hurrying, just floating in their lazy, endless circuit. A miniature weather system contained 4 walls. The fuller's own body heat joins the warmth of the bat, his calves and thighs radiating a gentle, steady warmth under his rolled hose, and a small, comfortable sweat begins to form on his forehead and the back of his neck, not from exertion, but from the ambient temperature and the enclosed space. A sweat that dries almost instantly in the slight draught from the window and leaves behind a faint, clean saltiness in his skin. He wipes his brow with the back of his wrist every quarter hour or so, an automatic gesture that he does not notice, and the motion is as much a part of the rhythm as the stomping. A small upward sweep of the hand that interrupts nothing and takes no time, blending into the ongoing pattern of his body's dance with the vat. The dampness on his forehead catches the light from the window and holds it as a thin, glittering sheen, a small bright detail in the dimness of the room, and then the sweat is reabsorbed or evaporated, and the sheen fades, replaced by the next sheen a few minutes later. A cycle as regular as the stomp and slosh. Upstairs, the guild members are also feeling the warmth that rises from below, though they are not aware of its source. They attribute the mild, pleasant heat in the floorboards to the sun that now shines on the roof tiles, or to the body heat of their gathered number, and they draw their benches slightly away from the table as the morning grows warmer, loosening the ties of their tunics and pushing back their hoods so that the cooler air from the window can reach their necks. Their conversation, which has moved from the standard measures of broadcloth to the price of woad in the southern ports, continues in its low, droning hum, and the scent of the ammonia that has seeped up through the floor mingles with their ink and their wool and their ale. A faint, sharp thread in the fabric of the air that they would notice if it were absent, but have long since ceased to notice because it is present at every meeting. A permanent, invisible guest at the table. The stricken belief in the Casnidi, the cartifinature of the county's cloth that stretches beyond the town's seal, and the ink, a dark, shiny liquid made from oak galls and iron salts, releases its own astringent scent, a smell that is sharp and metallic and that, in the staircase, meets the ammonia from below and forms a brief chemical marriage, a compound of smells that is unique to this building and this moment, a scent that will never be exactly reproduced. Bekestige of the Kestib when Biskiltly hidden. The fuller, meanwhile, feels the warmth the vat through his entire body. Now, as quime could is, it settled into a state that is close to the feeling of a warm bath at the end of a long day, a state in which the muscles and Takabidik and Steed that is close to the feeling of a warm bath at the end of a long day. A state in which the muscles are heavy and the thoughts are slow and the boundary between the self and the segrind, but stamped in the mind, begun bain spout and tactile and pleiftid and bertfid. For now, though, the moment holds, and the warmth and the smell and the rhythm are all there is. A small, complete world tucked into the ground floor of a half-timbered building on a narrow lane in a cloth-making town, and the rest of the world, with its distant wars and its distant kings and its distant weather, might as well be a rumour, a faint, irrelevant noise at the edge of a sleep that never quite arrives, but that hovers, always, just behind the fuller's half-closed eyes. Above the fuller's head, the ceiling boards transmit the sounds of arrival with a clarity that turns each footstep into a distinct, muted thud, a shuffle and scrape of leather on oak, and the occasional heavier knock of a walking stick or the legs of a chair being moved into place around the long meeting table. These sounds come down through the beams in a sequence that has no hurry, a slow accumulation of small noises that blend with the regular slosh and thump of the stomping below without disturbing its rhythm, and the fuller, still working the board with his steady, even pace, hears them as one might hear the arrival of birds in a tree, a gradual addition of presence that changes the character of the silence without breaking it. The footsteps begin near the door to the staircase, a heavy iron-hinged ring chissen. That's called Sven. In that point they spread outward across the floorboards in paths that the fuller could trace from memory, because he has heard the same pattern so many times before. The guildmaster moves straight to the head of the table, his walking stick tapping a slow measured beat on the oak. The scribe, with his dragging left foot, crosses to the small desk, You can trace the progress of the guild members by listening, the way footsteps cluster near the door and then spread out toward the far wall where the window looks down onto the narrow street, and the whole sequence unfolds with the same deliberate pacing as the stomping below, a parallel rhythm of a town going about its ordinary business on a spring morning in the 14th century. The fuller does not pause to listen, his ears simply receive the sounds as they come, and his body, which knows every creak of this building, integrates the information without requiring his mind to form a single thought about it. A pair of heavy work boots, worn by the dyer who has walked in from his shed along the river, produce a dull, solid thumping that the floorboards carry with a slight vibration, while the softer shoes of the merchant who trades in English broadcloth make a lighter, brushing sound, a whisper of leather on wood that is barely audible above the vat's own voice. Each footstep is distinct for a moment, then merges into the general murmur of the gathering until the individual arrivals become a single, collective noise, a low, living presence that presses down through the ceiling and fills the space between the beams. The merchants drape their cloaks over the back of a bench, the wool of those cloaks having been fulled years ago in this very same workshop by a different fuller who is now old and living with his daughter near the east gate, and the sound of the heavy fabric falling into place is a soft, muffled flump, a noise so gentle that it might be confused with a breath of wind against the shutters. Each cloak is a piece of the town's own history, woven from local fleeces and stamped with the lead seal that guarantees its width and weight, and as they lie draped across the bench, they form a pile of browns and greys that hold the faint, residual smell of their owners' houses, a blend of wood smoke and rushes and the herbs that women tuck into storage chests. The fuller does not see these cloaks, of course, but he has seen them many times before on the occasions when the guild members leave the meeting room and pass through the workshop on their way to the street, and so he knows their colours and their textures in the same way he knows the grain of the vat's wooden staves, a knowledge that is stored in the back of his mind and never called upon but always present, a quiet, unremarkable familiarity. The greetings that the merchants exchange drift down through the ceiling as a low, continuous murmur, too muffled to make out as individual words, but carrying the distinct cadence of polite, unhurried speech, the sort of talk that passes time rather than conveying urgent news. You might stand near the staircase and hear the rise and fall of voices, a gentle undulating wave of sound that never sharpens into clarity, but remains a soft, blurred background, like the murmur of a brook heard from a distance, and if you listened long enough you might begin to distinguish the different voices as you might distinguish the different stones in that brook, each one a slightly different pitch, a slightly different pitch, a slightly different rhythm, but all flowing together in a single agreeable stream. The fuller, who has heard these greetings for 20 years, does not try to separate them. For him, they are simply the sound of the guild assembling. a noise as predictable and as comforting as the creak of the vat's iron bands when the liquid warms up, and it tells him that the meeting will soon begin. The long, slow discussion that will carry on above his head while his feet continue their work. The guildmaster's walking stick, a heavy length of blackthorn with an iron ferrule, produces a distinctive tap-tap pause that the fuller recognizes instantly, a sound that has been part of the building soundscape since the current master took the position 7 years ago, and it announces his movements as he circles the table, checking that the seal press and the weight box are in their proper places, his steps slow and deliberate with the weight of age and authority. The other voice is lower slightly as the master moves, a subtle, unconscious sign of deference that is so habitual that no one notices it, and then the scrape of the master's chair signals that he has taken his seat, a deep, resonant scrape that vibrates through the floorboards and makes the cobweb near the vat tremble once before settling. The chair itself is old and heavy, with thick turned legs and a broad seat worn to a dark polish by the successive masters who have occupied it, and the sound of its movement is always the same, a two-part noise of wood on wood, followed by a creak of the joints, a sound that the fuller might note without thinking, just as he notes the shift in the light or the temperature of the liquid around his ankles. As the chairs cease their scraping and a general stillness settles over the guild hall, the floorboards stop their active complaint and the building shifts into a mode of suspended weight, the gathered men above and the stomping man below forming a vertical stack of human industry that has been repeated in this spot since long before anyone can remember. A continuity as steady as the river that powers the fulling mill at the edge of town, though this vat remains hand-worked by the guild's own fuller for finest cloth. The stillness does not mean silence. The ceiling still carries the small, constant noises of men at rest. The soft rustle of a tunic as a merchant leans forward on his elbows, the distant jingle of a purse set on the table, the occasional muted cough that is quickly stifled, and beneath all of these the ever-present rhythm of the fuller's feet, which has not paused for the arrival of the guild and will not pause for the duration of the meeting, a steady, ground-floor heartbeat that anchors the building. The guild members settle into their places around the long table, a table that was built in this room and is too large to ever be moved, and as they settle, they arrange their materials before them. The scribe lays out his quills and his inkpot and his inkpot and his sheets of parchment. The guildmaster places the heavy lead seal and the box of standard weights at his right hand, and the other merchants produce their own small leather pouches and account rolls from the folds of their tunics, opening them with the soft, dry crack of a loaved parchment. These sounds, each one tiny and insignificant, combine to create a quiet background of preparation, a rustling, settling noise that is the auditory equivalent of a bird arranging its nest, and it continues for several minutes while the men exchange the last few personal remarks before the meeting is formally opened. The fuller hears this rustling as he might hear the leaves of a tree stirring in a light breeze, a sound so gentle that it barely registers, and his feet continue their slow, even stomp, the board rocking beneath him with a rhythm that is now as much a part of the building as the old oak timber itself. From outside, the narrow street below the Guildhall window contributes its own small sounds to the assembly. The distant clop of a horse on the cobbles, the brief, high call of a woman selling fresh milk from a pail, and the soft scrape of a shutter being opened across the lane. Noises that drift in through the thick glass and settle into the room like dust, adding another layer to the quiet hum of the morning. The merchants, accustomed to the street sounds, do not turn their heads or pause their conversation. The outside world is simply there, a constant, unobtrusive presence that has no bearing on the business of the guild, and in the same way the fuller, deep in the rhythm of the stomping, does not distinguish between the sounds from above and the sounds from outside, accepting them all as a single, blended environment, a wash of audio that cocoons him in the familiar. The street noise, muffled by the walls and the distance, reaches the workshop as a faint, hazy impression of activity, never sharp enough to distract, just a gentle reminder that the town is awake and moving, going about its ordinary day in parallel with the ordinary day unfolding within this building. The fuller, his hand still resting lightly on the overhead beam, feels the vibration of the guild settling through the wood, a faint, diffuse tremor that joins the stronger, more focused vibration of the vat slosh, and his body, which has learned to read the building signals over many years, knows without any conscious interpretation that the meeting has reached its moment of readiness. the point at which the guildmaster will clear his throat and begin the formal proceedings. This knowledge is not a thought, but a physical sensation, a subtle change in the pressure of the air or the tension of the timbers, something that the fuller would be unable to explain if asked, but that he trusts as completely as he trusts the feel of the cloth beneath his feet. He does not pause or look up. His feet continue their slow, patient work, and his mind remains in that calm, floating space where the borders between the body and the building are soft and permeable, a state that is not sleep, but rests just on the edge of it, a quiet, waking doze that makes the hours pass like water. The scribe, seated at his small desk by the window, dips his quill into the iron gall ink and holds it poised above the parchment while he waits for the guildmaster to begin the opening recitation, and the soft, wet sound of the nib touching the ink is so faint that it does not reach the workshop at all, lost in the gap between the floorboards. Yet the fuller knows somehow that the scribe is ready, just as he knows that the dyer has folded his arms across his chest and leaned back on his bench, a posture that the fuller has dimmed the past of the tsterv. These small individual habits of the guild members are as familiar to the fuller as the individual quirks of the vat, the way the board creaks in a certain spot, or the way the liquid sounds different near the east side, and they form a web of quiet, unspoken acquaintance that binds the men upstairs to the man below. A connection that is never acknowledged, but that has been built by thousands of shared mornings, each one identical to the last. The building itself rests in this moment of suspended weight, with a kind of patience that is older than any of the people inside it. The oak timbers and the stone foundation and the thick wattle and daub walls holding the gathering in a quiet embrace that has sheltered this same scene for generations. And the only sign of the passage of time is the slow, steady aging of the wood, and the gradual darkening of the urine vat's tide line, a stain that has crept higher by imperceptible degrees over the marketing the foul it is, added Ben Ailated. The fuller, who has added his own mark to that tide line with every day of labour, does not think about the past or the future. He thinks only of the cloth beneath his feet and the warmth around his ankles and the slow, steady beat that carries him forward into the long, quiet middle of the morning. A morning that will be followed by another morning, and another after that, in a chain of mornings that stretches back to the founding of the guild and forward into a time that no one in the room will ever see. The quiet greetings above have now faded completely, replaced by the single, measured voice of the guildmaster as he begins the formal opening of the meeting, a voice that is deep and slow and carries a trace of the nasal accent of the northern towns where the master spent his youth. And the fuller, hearing this voice as a low, droning hum through the floorboards, adjusts his pace by a fraction of a beat to match its cadence. A small, unconscious synchronization that true rhythms into a loose, comfortable alignment. The merchants, their private conversations concluded, sit in silence and listen to the opening words that they have heard at every meeting for years, a formula of invocation and announcement that is as predictable as the sunrise, and their stillness above joins the stillness of the cloth below, which now lies in the vat as a dense waterlogged mass, no longer a bundle of separate folds but a single continuous piece of fabric that has begun to take on the character of finished cloth, thick and soft and full of the quiet labour of the man who walks on it. Once the guildmaster has completed the formal opening and the meeting has been called to order, the voices from above descend through the floorboards as a low, sustained murmur that is no longer punctuated by individual greetings, but has become a single, continuous fabric of sound, a gentle, rolling drone in which the words have been blurred together by the thickness of the oak planks, so that not one of them can be separated from the rest, and the effect is like listening to a distant brook after a long rain, a steady, unhurried flow it fludes, and the pans schwananti schlittens fleets finning campbarn. The fuller hears this changed tone with a small unconscious adjustment of his posture, his shoulders settling even lower as the business of the guild properly begins, and the stomping board beneath his feet continues its slow rocking rhythm with a steadiness that seems to answer the murmur above. Not in any deliberate way, but simply because both sounds are part of the same long, quiet morning, two halves of a single, unhurried process that has been going on in this building for more years than anyone alive can count. The scribe's quill begins to scratch across the parchment in short, intermittent bursts, a tiny, dry sound that is too faint to reach the workshop, but that the fuller can imagine because he has seen the scribe write many times when collecting his payment, and that scratching in his mind adds a third rhythm to the two that already fill the building, a small sharp counterpoint that never lasts long before the next voice rises and the quill stops again to listen. The subject of the guild's talk is the regulation of cloth quality and the standardization of measures, matters that return to the agenda at every meeting and are never truly settled because the cloth itself is always slightly different, the fleeces from one year to the next carrying more or less grease, the weaver's hands producing bolts that vary by a hair's breadth in width, and the dyer's bats yielding shades that do not precisely match the sample kept in the guild chest. These topics are so familiar to the Mr. Slow, comfortable repetition, using phrases that have been passed down from master to apprentice and will be passed down again long after the current members have been laid to rest in the churchyard by the river. Phrases about the proper width of a bolt of wool measured in ells and inches, the acceptable number of weft threads per inch that a sealed broadcloth buds contain, the pints of fuller's earth from the pits near the coast, and the penalties for any merchant who tries to stretch his cloths beyond the denads. The fuller hears these discussions as he has heard them for 20 years, not as information, but as a comfortable, droning backdrop that keeps his mind from wandering into any place of hurry or worry, a human noise that blends with the slosh of the vat and the creak of his own ankle joints to make a single, quiet music, the sound of a working town keeping itself in order. The guildmaster's voice when he speaks at length is a slow, measured baritone that rolls through the floorboards with a warmer, deeper resonance than the other voices, and it tends to begin each new topic with a formal preamble that the other merchants know so well they could recite it themselves, an invocation of the guild's founding charter and the responsibilities laid down by the town council, followed by a deliberate pause during which the scribe dips his quill and the younger merchants shift on their benches. The fuller can track the master's long speeches by the way the murmur from above grows quieter as everyone else stops speaking, leaving only the single heavy voice to carry on for a minute or two before it is replaced by a scattering of shorter replies, the other merchants adding their own opinions in turn, each one met by a soft, general hum of assent or a low, thoughtful murmur that rumbles through the ceiling like the sound of a hive being gently disturbed. These exchanges never rise to argument. The guild is a body of men who have known each other for decades and whose disagreements, when they occur, are settled by slow negotiation and the weight of precedent rather than by loud words, and the atmosphere that comes down through the floorboards is not one of conflict, but of a steady, patient deliberation that runs as smoothly as the oiled axle of a cart. Occasionally a name detaches itself from the blurred wash of sound and falls into the workshop with a brief temporary clarity, a name like Elias the dyer, who supplies the blue watt-dyed fleeces for the finest broadcloth, or the widow who runs the spinning house on Parchment Lane and whose thread is said to be the most even in the town, and the fuller may note these names without reflection, his attention never leaving the feel of the cloth beneath his feet, as it grows steadily denser and cleaner with each passing hour. The mention of the widow's name brings with it a faint, fleeting image in the fuller's mind, a picture of the narrow house with its ground floor spinning wheels and its upper window where the finished thread is hung to air. But the image dissolves almost at once, replaced by the immediate sensation of the board rocking under his soles and the warm urine washing over his ankles, and he does not hold on to it or try to bring it back. The discussion above moves on to the price of alum from the eastern trading houses, a substance used by the dyers to fix colours in the wool, and the fuller, who has no need of alum in his own work, lets this talk pass over him without any attempt to follow it, his mind resting in the same calm, neutral space that it has occupied since the stomping began hours ago. The different voices above create a pattern that the fuller's ear has learned to recognize without any effort, a sequence of familiar timbres that recur in a loose, predictable order like the notes of a simple tune played on a pipe. There is the dyer, whose voice is hoarse and low from years of breathing the fumes of his vats. And there is the young merchant who inherited his father's stall in the cloth hall and speaks with a nervous, rapid delivery that always draws a few slow, patient answers from the older men. And there is the fat merchant from the west side of town whose deep belly laugh rumbles through the floor with a distinctive rolling vibration that makes the dust motes in the window shaft tremble for a nubbleton back into their slow, downward drift. The fuller knows these voices as he knows the different creaks of the floorboards under his bare feet. The one near the vat's east rim that always groans when he shifts his weight leftward, and the one by the door that has been silent all morning because no one has crossed it since the guild members took their seats. And this knowledge is not something he ever thinks about, but simply a part of the texture of his daily life, as ordinary as the taste of ale or the feel of the sun on his neck. The murmuring above continues without interruption, except for the occasional pause when the scribe reads back a section of the minutes to confirm a decision. And during these pauses, the workshop fills with a different kind of quiet, a brief, expectant stillness in which the only sound is the slosh and thump of the stomping and the distant, muffled noises of the street outside, the creak of a cart's wheel, or a dog's single, indifferent bark. These pauses feel, to the fuller, like the moments between breaths. A small suspension of the background hum that makes the workshop seem suddenly larger and more empty, though nothing else has changed. And then the scribe's flat, nasal voice stops reading, and the murmur rises again, filling the gap and restoring the world to its familiar, comfortable balance. The fuller, during these pauses, does not feel any curiosity about what has been decided. The decisions of the guild are not his to make or to question, and his task is simply to work the cloth until it is ready for the rinsing trough. A task that does not depend on the price of woad or the width of a London broadcloth, but only on the steady, patient pressure of his feet and the chemical patience of the fermented urine. The sound of the discussion, as it flows on through the middle of the morning, becomes a kind of lullaby for the fuller, argental oral blanket that wraps around the slosh of the vat and the heat of the liquid and the slow, regular movement of his legs, and he sometimes closes his eyes for a minute or two at a time while his feet continue their work. Not sleeping, but drifting in a state of quiet, wakeful rest in which the boundaries between his body and the building seem to soften and blur, so that the creak of the beam therearm beneath that's when he opens his eyes again, the light has moved a little further across the wall, the sun now past the window's central pane and beginning to slant through the thicker, greener glass at the side. And the quality of the light has changed from the grey-green of early morning to a warmer, mellower gold that pools on the flagstones and seems to thicken the air, making the dust motes glow like tiny, floating sparks that drift and turn in their slow, endless circulation. The guild members above, meanwhile, have moved on to the matter of the upcoming fair at the next market town, a fair that will be held in the wide meadow beyond the abbey walls at the end of the month, and the discussion of the fair has a lighter tone than the talk of measures and penalties, the voices laced with a faint, comfortable amusement, the sort of talk that men make when they are looking forward to a journey and the chance to see old acquaintances. The fuller can detect this shift in tone even without hearing any words, because the rhythm of the murmur changes, becoming more varied, the pauses shorter, and occasionally a low, soft chuckle from the fat merchant rumbles through the floorboards and makes the liquid in the vat shiver with a tiny answering ripple, a ripple that is gone before the next stomp can disturb it. The fuller does not smile or react in any outward way, but somewhere deep in his body there is a small reflexive relaxation, a loosening of the very last tension he did not know he was holding, because the sound of men laughing, however distant and muffled, is a sound that tells him all is well, that the guild is in agreement, that the morning is proceeding as it should. His feet continue their steady, even pace, the left heel pressing down into the board with a solid, deliberate thump, followed by the glugging drawl of the liquid as it resettles, and then the right heel in its turn, a rhythm that has now been going on for so long that it has become a part of the fuller's body, as automatic as the beating of his heart or the slow tidal motion of his lungs drawing in the warm, ammoniated air and releasing it into the cooler atmosphere of the room. The cloth beneath him has reached the halfway point of its filling, the point where the fibres have begun to mat together into the early stages of felt, but are not yet fully locked, and the fuller can feel this change as a subtle increase in the springiness of the board, a slight resilient bounce that was not there an hour ago, and that tells him the wool is working, the grease dissolving, the fabric thickening into the dense, durable material that will become someone's cloak or tunic, a garment that will keep out the wind and the rain, and will cave at the work bed out, but the top The guild members, unaware of the progress of the cloth below them but entirely dependent on that progress for their trade, continue their talk of the fair, discussing which merchants from the neighboring towns are likely to attend and what cloths they will bring, and the scribe makes a note of the dates and the travel arrangements, his quill scratching out the words with a haste that is still slow by any ordinary measure, but is quicker than his usual pace, because even the scribe, a man of quiet, solitary habits, is stirred by the thought of that Mars and the thing whose purple the fuller has been to this fair himself, years ago when he was an apprentice, and he remembers it as a blur of bright tents and loud voices and the smell of roasting meat. A memory that is too full of detail to be restful, and so he does not dwell on it, letting it pass through his mind and out again, while his attention returns to the immediate, soothing reality of the vat, the board, and the cloth, the three elements of his world that never change and never ask for anything more than he is already giving. The murmur from above continues to flow, a river of sound that has no beginning and no end, and the fuller, standing in his warm amber bath, lets it wash over him without resistance. His body doing its work and his mind floating free, the two of them moving together through the long, quiet middle of the morning, a morning that is not yet half over but already feels as complete and as peaceful as any morning could ever be. A small, unremarkable stretch of time in a small, unremarkable town, and not by the witty by. The cloth in the vat has now been under the fuller's feet for enough time that the wool fibers have begun their slow transformation from a loose, open weave into something denser and more cohesive, and the fuller, feeling this change through the soles of his feet, knows without counting or measuring that the moment has come to turn the fabric so that the fulling proceeds evenly across every inch of the bolt. He does not consult any clock or any outside signal. His body tells him a subtle shift in the resistance of the board, a slight firmness that was not there an hour ago and that communicates itself up through his ankles and his shins as a change in the familiar texture of the work. A quiet notification from the cloth to the man that the underside has received its share of the stomping and the upper side now wants its turn. The fuller slows his pace by a fraction, not stopping but gradually reducing the speed of his feet until the thump and glug becomes a slower, more deliberate sound, and then he pauses altogether, lifting his right foot and then his left from the board with a gentle, unhurried motion that makes no splash, the urine closing over his departing ankles in a soft, sucking whisper that seems almost reluctant to let him go. He stands for a moment on the top step of the wooden platform, one hand still resting on the overhead beam, and lets the liquid drain from his legs in thin amber rivulets that trace the contours of his calves and shins and fall back into the vat in a series of small, distinct drips that make tiny, fleeting circles on the surface, circles that spread outward and vanish into the general stillness, with a gentle, silent finality. The feeling of the air on his wet skin is cool, but not cold, a mild, pleasant contrast to the warmth of the bath, and he flexes his toes once, twice, feeling the slight stiffness that comes from standing in one position for so long, a stiffness that will fade as soon as he resumes his motion, and then he bends forward from the waist and reaches down into the vat with both arms, submerging his hands and his forearms in the amber liquid to find the edge of the cloth beneath the board. The urine closes over his skin with a now familiar warmth, and his fingers, moving with the blind accuracy of long practice, locate the corner of the fabric where it peeks out from under the board's side cleat, a small folded lip of wool that feels soft and heavy and utterly saturated, like a thick piece of felted blanket left in a basin of warm water. He grips this corner between his thumb and forefinger, a gentle but firm hold that does not tear or stretch the fragile half-felted wool. And then he pulls upward with a slow, steady force that brings the cloth rising out of the liquid in a dark, dripping mass, the urine streaming from the fabric in hundreds of tiny rivulets that catch the light from the window and flash a dull, golden brown before falling back into the vat with a soft, continuous patter, a sound like a very quiet rain falling on a very still pond. The cloth emerges in folds that are heavier than they were when they went in, the fabric now carrying the weight of the absorbed liquid and the weight of its own increasing density, and the fuller uses both hands to support the bundle as it clears the surface, his arms straining with a low, steady effort. that he has made so many times that he no longer notices the labor of it. He holds the cloth above the vat for a long moment, letting the last of the excess urine drain away while he examines the fabric with a slow, careful gaze, his eyes moving across the surface of the wool to check for any unevenness in the fulling, any patch that has not received the full pressure of the stomping board, any thin spot that might weaken the finished cloth and cause it to fail the guild's inspection. The fabric, though still rough and unfinished, has visibly changed since it entered the vat at dawn. The individual yarns that were visible as distinct, twisted threads in the raw wool have begun to lose their separate identities, the fibers swelling and tangling together under the combined action of the ammonia and the pressure, so that the weave is now partially obscured by a fine, matted surface that is the beginning of the felted finish, a soft, cloudy bloom of entangled wool that will become thicker and with it subtitus. The color of the cloth has deepened as well, the pale, dusty brown of the raw fleece darkening to a rich, wet umber that is the color of good earth after a rain, a color that the dyer will later replace with madder red or woad blue, but that for now is simply the honest, unadorned shade of clean wool. The fuller notes these changes with a quiet, professional satisfaction, a feeling that is too mild to be called pride, but that warms him somewhere deep in his chest, a small, steady glow of competence that comes from knowing that the work is proceeding as it should, that the cloth is healthy, that the vat is active, that nothing has gone wrong, and nothing will. He turns the cloth in his hands now, flipping the folds over so that the side that was facing down against the board will now face upward and receive the direct pressure of the cleats, and he rearranges the fabric in the vat with a series of slow, careful movements, spreading the wool across the bottom once more, smoothing out the wrinkles with his palms, and tucking the edges under where they might otherwise float free and escape the stomping. His hands work with the same unhurried precision as his feet, each motion deliberate and each adjustment small, and the whole process of turning the cloth takes perhaps 5 minutes, a span of time in which nothing else happens in the workshop, just the soft, wet sounds of the fabric being repositioned and the gentle, intermittent drip of the urine falling back into the vat. A quiet interlude between the long stretches of the stomping that its own way, as the stomping itself, a small meditative task that asked us enough in deep the marsh till it bagged. Fit after these with quiet there. When the cloth is arranged to his satisfaction, the fuller picks up the stomping board from where it has been floating at the side of the vat and eases it back into position over the newly turned fabric, sliding the bottom edge under the folds with a soft, submerged thump that makes the liquid quiver once before settling, and then he checks the placement by pressing down gently with both hands on the top edge, feeling the familiar, springy resistance of the wool compressed between the board and the vat's curved bottom. The board sits securely, the cleats pressing the cloth flat and holding it in place, and the fuller nods once, that same small, private gesture of confirmation that he made at the start of the day, and then he straightens up, wipes his wet forearms on the front of his tunic in a quick, absent motion, and places his hand back on the overhead beam, his fingers finding their old groove in the polished wood as if they had never left it. He climbs back onto the board with the same smooth, careful transition he used the first time, his right foot entering the warm liquid and finding its place on the cleat, then his left foot following, and the vat sloshes once with a deep hollow knock as his full weight settles onto the board, a sound that seems to announce the resumption of the stomping, and that draws a brief answering creak from a beam overhead, as if the building itself were acknowledging the rhythm. The fuller resumes his pace without any period of adjustment, his feet lifting and falling in the same slow, steady sequence as before, the thump and plug picking up exactly where it left off, with no variation in tempo or force, and the workshop, which had been suspended in a brief, quiet pause during the turning of the cloth, settles back into its regular ongoing rhythm, the sound of the stomping once again filling the room like a heartbeat steady and endlessly patient. The cloth beneath his feet feels slightly different now, the newly turned side offering a slightly softer resistance because it has not yet been compressed by the board's cleats, and the fuller notes this difference through his soles with a small automatic part of his attention, the part that monitors the cloth's progress and that will know, when the fabric feels uniform in its springiness, that the fulling is complete. The warmth of the vat, which had begun to cool slightly during the pause, returns to its full, comfortable heat as the stomping agitates. the liquid and brings the deeper, warmer layers up to the surface, and the fuller's legs, which had also begun to cool in the open air, warm again with a pleasant, spreading tingle that rises from his soles up to his knees and makes the muscles of his calves relax into the familiar, repetitive motion. The guild above has moved on to a discussion of the dye's latest batch of madder, a root that produces a deep, fast red when prepared correctly, and the dye's hoarse voice is now the dominant sound coming through the floorboards, a low, gravely rumble that describes the quality of the roots brought by the last cart from the southern markets. The other merchants listen with the patient attention of men who have heard similar reports at every meeting, but who know that the quality of the madder affects the quality of the dyed cloth and the price it will fetch at the fair, and their occasional interjections, brief and low, drift down through the ceiling, as soft, secondary notes that blend with the dyer's voice and a steady stomp of the fuller's feet. The fuller, who knows the dyer and has watched him work many times in his shed by the river, a small dark building that smells of roots and steam and the sharp tang of the alum fixative, can picture the dyer's face as he speaks, the way his brow furrows and his hands move in slow, descriptive gestures, even when he is seated, hands that are permanently stained, a faint mottled red from years of handling the madder, a stain that never washes off and that marks him as surely as the fuller's own brown-stained hands mark his. The stomping continues through the dyer's report, the cloth now entering its second phase of fulling, in which the newly turned side begins to felt under the pressure of the board, while the underside rests against the vat's curved bottom, soaking in the warm ammonia and releasing the last of its grease into the liquid, a process that is symmetrical and balanced and requires no intervention from the fuller beyond the steady, patient rhythm of his feet. He sometimes allows his eyes to close for a minute or two while the motion carries on, his body maintaining the stomping with the unthinking reliability of a water wheel turning in a steady current. And when his eyes are closed, the sounds of the workshop arrange themselves into a pattern that is almost musical, a deep, regular bass note of the vat's hollow thump, overlaid with the kaya, liquid glug of the urine resettling, the two sounds alternating in a rhythm that never varies, while a boat bathes, while the fuller's breathing, slow and deep, has synchronized itself to the stomping without any conscious effort, his inhale occurring over the space of 2 heel presses and his exhale over the next 2, a cycle of breath that matches the cycle of his feet so that the whole of his body is engaged in a single, integrated motion, and this integration produces a state of calm that is deeper than any rest, a state in which the boundaries between work and rest dissolve and the stomping becomes not a task but simply the thing that it is happening. The stahaprical of the funicking. The light through the window has now reached its full midday strength, a warm golden shaft that falls directly onto the vat and illuminates the dark swirling surface of the liquid, and the dust motes that dance in the shaft are so thick that they form a visible column of golden light, a pillar of slow, drifting particles that seem solid enough to touch but would dissolve into nothing if you tried, a small, silent miracle that the fuller has seen 1,000 times and never tires of seeing. The turning of the cloth has marked the midpoint of the day's work, and the fuller knows, somewhere in the back of his mind where such knowledge resides, that there will be perhaps 2 more turns before the fulling is complete and the cloth can be lifted for the last time and carried to the rinsing trough. But this knowledge does not hurry him or change his pace. He will continue the stomping with the same steady beat until the cloth tells him it is done. And then he will continue it a little longer, to be sure, because rushing the work and do all though that core hours as of his petty east siminet the gilder mive colton mivel that's its carbibulation wive comfortable familiar tangle, and the scribe's quill scratches its way across the parchment in short, intermittent bursts that are like tiny dry leaves falling on a still forest floor, a sound too faint to hear, but somehow present all the same. A tiny, sharp note in the great, soft symphony of the morning, and the fuller, standing in his warm abspad. By the time the sun has climbed high enough to shine directly through the workshop window, the light has changed from the grey-green dimness of early morning to a warm golden pour that enters the room not as a single shaft, but as a broad, slanted flood, catching the wooden vat, and the stomping board and the fuller's moving figure in a rich honeyed glow that seems to thicken the air and slow the passage of time even further, as if the whole workshop had been submerged in a gentle amber-tinted oil. His thick greenish panes, which earlier had filtered the dawn into a watery sunset, it's meant to mean a glowing light that holds a trace of green at its edges, and this light falls upon the vat's dark tide line and the iron bands and the swirling surface of the urine with a calm, steady radiance praising decay. The tiny hairline cracks in the plasten word creeps. The delicate waver, its dime widths the pomoy deterate. The fuller feels the warmth of this new light on the back of his neck and on the tops of his bare shoulders, where his tunic has slipped down during the long hours of work. A pleasant spreading heat that joins the heat, rising from the vat to create a sensation of being gently toasted from above and below. A comfort so complete that it would be easy to close the eyes and let the body continue its rhythm while the mind slipped into a light, waking sleep, a sleep that the fuller often chords during these midday hours when the sun's at its zenith. He does not look directly at the window, because to do so would be to face a blinding glare after so many hours in the dimness. But he is aware of the light as a constant, gentle pressure against his eyelids whenever he blinks, a red gold warmth that colors the inside of his sight and makes the darkness behind his lids feel friendly and close. His hand, still resting on the overhead beam, has grown warm where the light touches the wood, and he can feel the slight difference in temperature between the sun-warmed section under his palm and the cooler section beyond, a difference that is as subtle as the change in the cloth's texture and that he notices only as a small background comfort. The dust motes that were invisible in the early dimness and then scattered in a single shaft now fill the whole room with a slow, glittering drift, myriads of tiny particles that catch the golden light and become visible as a soft, suspended haze, a cloud of floating wool fibers and fine dirt, and the microscopic debris of the workshop that moves not with any purpose but with the same lazy tidal motion as the air itself, stirred by the fuller's gentle motions and by the faint, warm convection rising from the vat. You could watch a single mote for a long, calm interval, and see it rise a little on an invisible current, pause as if reconsidering its path, and then sink downward by a hand's breadth before being caught up again and carried sideways, its movement so slow and so graceful that it seems to be dancing to a music too quiet for human ears, a music made of the building's creaks and the liquid slosh and the distant, muffled murr of the guild above. The fuller does not watch the dust motes with any conscious attention, but they are part of the familiar texture of his day, a constant, gentle motion at the edge of his vision that contributes to the sense of the workshop as a living, breathing space, a space that is never entirely still, but moves with a slowness that is its own kind of stillness. The light picks out the grain of the wooden vat, and makes each ring and knot glow with a rich, dark luster, the oak appearing almost polished where the fuller's body has rubbed against it over the years, and it catches the wet film on the stomping board and turns it into a thin, shining membrane that flashes a dull gold whenever the board rocks forward. A brief, liquid gleam that is there, and then gone in the space of a single stomp. The reflection of the light on the ceiling, cast upward from the vat's moving surface, quivers in time with the sloshing liquid, a shifting coin of amber brightness that slides across the dark beams and the old cobwebs and the rough plaster. Its movement hypnotic to watch if you have the patience to lie on your back and stare upward, a patience that the fuller has in abundance, though he rarely looks directly at the reflection because his eyes are usually half closed, his attention turned inward to the cloth. The light on the ceiling moves in a slow, irregular circle, expanding when the liquid is still for a moment between stomps and contracting when the next heel press sends a ripple across the vat, a breathing of light that is the visual counterpart to the rhythmic thump and glug that fills the room. Upstairs, the guild members have broken for their small midday meal, a pause in the formal proceedings that comes at the same hour every meeting, and that is signalled by the guildmaster's voice falling silent and the shuffling of many feet as the merchants rise from their benches and move toward the side table where the food and drink have been laid out. The sound of this break reaches the workshop as a series of slow, comfortable noises, the scrape of chair legs on the oak floor, the low, rumbling murmur of voices that have dropped their formal tone and now speak in the easy, casual way of men who have sat together all morning and will sit together all afternoon. The soft clink of pottery cups being passed from hand to hand, and the faint, dry rustle of a linen cloth being unwrapped from a loaf of bread. The fuller hears these sounds with the same distant, untroubled awareness as he hears the sparrows that nest in the eaves, a small, cheerful chirping that has accompanied the break since the meeting's first hour, and he does not pause his stomping or alter his pace because the cloth does not know that the men above are eating. The cloth knows only the steady pressure of the board and the chemical patience of the urine. The smell of the guild's food drifts down through the floorboards in faint, pleasant threads that weave themselves into the ammoniated air of the workshop. The yeasty, warm scent of fresh bread broken open, the sharp, clean tang of hard cheese cut with a knife, and the mild, fruity note of small ale that has been poured from a leather flask into the clay cups. These food smells are not strong enough to overpower the vat, but they add a new layer to the workshop's atmosphere, a reminder that the world above is a world of men who eat and drink and talk, while the world below is a world of one man who stomps and a vat that works, and a cloth that slowly, patiently becomes something new. The fuller, who ate his own meal of bread and ale before the guild meeting began, feels no hunger at the smell. It is simply another note in the long, slow chord of the day, a note that will fade when the meal is finished and the guild returns to its deliberations. The sound of the guild's eating is a quiet, unhurried affair, the men chewing slowly and speaking between mouthfuls in voices that are lower and more relaxed than before, the conversation turning from matters of trade to small, personal topics. A question about a man's son, a remark about the early peas in a garden, a brief low laugh that rumbles through the floorboards like a distant roll of thunder. The fuller, who has no son and no garden, listens to these sounds without envy or curiosity. They are the background music of his life, the comfortable noise of men who have no knowledge of the stomping below, but whose work depends entirely on the stomping below. A dependence that neither group ever thinks about, because the cloth simply arrives at their stalls in the cloth hall with the guild seal on its corner, and no one asks how it got there. The break in the formal meeting does nothing to alter the pace of the work. The fuller's feet continue their slow, steady press, the board rocks with its familiar, gentle seesaw, the liquid responds with its hollow knock and its wet, whispering drawl, and the dust motes, undisturbed by any change in the rhythm, drift on in their slow, golden dance. The light, meanwhile, has begun its slow, imperceptible descent from the zenith. A descent so gradual that you could watch the shadow of the window's leading edge on the far wall for a full minute and see no movement at all. Yet over the course of the midday hour, the rectangle of light on the plaster shifts from the vat's eastern rim to a spot a hand's breadth higher, a migration that is as steady and as unstoppable as the fulling of the cloth. The shadow of a bird passing outside the window falls suddenly across the light and is gone in an instant. A swift, dark flicker that makes no sound and leaves no trace, and the fuller does not startle or look up because the movement was too quick for the eye to catch. A mere blink in the golden field of his half-closed vision. A small, fleeting event that changes nothing and is immediately forgotten. The sparrows in the eaves, which have been silent through the morning, now begin a soft, sporadic chirping, encouraged by the warmth of the sun on the roof tiles, and their tiny, scratchy voices join the other sounds of the room, a thin, high counterpoint to the deep thump of the vat. The fuller's body, which has been standing in the warm bath for many hours now, has settled into a state of deep physical contentment. His legs heavy and warm, and his back loose and his arms resting with a comfortable weight on the overhead beam, and he occasionally shifts his weight from one hip to the other with a slow rolling motion that does not interrupt the stomping, but simply redistributes the pressure across his soles. A motion that does not interrupt the stomping, but simply redistributes the pressure across his soles. A motion that feels good, in a way. The skin of his feet and ankles, softened by the prolonged soaking, has developed a slight, white wrinkling at the toes, a harmless effect of the moisture that will fade within an hour of leaving the vat. And he notices this wrinkling with the same detached, automatic attention as he notices the changing springiness of the cloth. A small physical fact that requires no action and provokes no thought. His breathing continues its slow, tidal rhythm, matched to the beat of his feet, and his eyes, half closed against the golden light, have taken on a soft, unfocused gaze that looks at nothing in particular, but sees everything at once, the vat, and the light, and the dust, and the dark corners, and the slow, steady, unchanging present moment. The guild's meal comes to an end with the same slow, comfortable pace with which it began, the sounds of eating fading into a last soft clink of cups being set aside, and a final low murmur of conversation that gradually subsides as the men return to their seats around the long table. The fuller hears the scrape of the benches as they settle back into place, a sequence of individual, heavy creaks that spread across the room above, and then the guildmaster's voice rises again, not in the formal tone of the morning, but in a slightly slower, slightly deeper version of itself. A voice that has been softened by the bread and the ale and the brief pleasant pause in the day's business. And the murmur of the guild resumes its low, steady flow, the afternoon session beginning with none of the ceremony of the morning, but with symphony to narrate the with. The sounds of the meal fade into memory, and the workshop settles back into its two-part rhythm, the stomping below and the talking above, a rhythm that has now been going on for so long that it seems to have no origin and no destination, just a gentle, ongoing continuity that contains the morning's freshness and the midday's warmth and the afternoon's slow golden decline, all held together in the amber light and the ammoniated air of this quiet, half-timbered building in the cloth-making town. The pod that stinted the geld furs palm off, the stiddy of the path, the stilled, the stint of the sound of self that because of the faith, but it is of them to set at the evil head. The afternoon hours bring no change to the work itself, only a gradual, almost imperceptible lengthening of the shadows across the workshop floor. A slow migration that began at midday and now continues with the same quiet persistence, the rectangle of sunlight from the high window sliding inch by inch up the far wall and growing paler as the sun begins its long, slow descent toward the rooftops of the cloth hall. Opposite, a descent so gradual that you could watch it for a full minutes, the quality of the light has shifted as well, the strong golden flood of noon giving way to a mellower, more honeyed tone that carries a hint of the coming evening in its deepened color, a light that is still warm but now softer, less insistent, as if the sun itself were growing drowsy and preparing to rest beyond the town's western gate. And this softer light falls across the fuller's shoulders and the back of his neck with a gentle fading heat that no longer warms quite as deeply as it did. And out the fuller's legs have grown heavy with the accumulated effort of the long day. A heaviness that is not tiredness in any sharp or painful sense, but a deep, settled warmth in his calves and thighs, a feeling that belongs to the task and is as much a part of the stomping as the urine and the wool, a sensation that has been building since dawn, and that now fills his lower body with a pleasant, weighted solidity, like the feeling of walking through deep, soft sand at the end of a long beach. His knees, which have been bending and straightening in their shallow, rhythmic dip for many hours, now produce a soft, regular creak at each press, a small, dry sound that joins the other noises of the room, and he is aware of this creak in the same distant, untroubled way that he is aware of the light changing on the wall, a bodily sound that is simply part of the afternoon's texture, a sign that the work has been long and steady, and that the body is keeping its own quiet record of the hours. He shifts his weight slightly, favoring his right leg for a few minutes to rest the left knee, and then shifts back again, the adjustment so small and so frequent that the rhythm of the stomping never wavers, the thump and glug continuing its steady, unhurried beat with the same constancy it has held since the morning. The guild meeting above has resumed its droning tenor after the midday meal, now focused on the letters from the London merchants concerning the export of dyed broadcloth and the taxes due at the port, matters that are weighty and bureaucratic and that require long, slow readings from the scribe's parchment rolls, the scribe's flat, nasal voice carrying through the floorboards in a monotonous rhythmic chant that lists quantities and duties and the names of ships, words that drift down into the workshop as a soothing, but puther the truths, and the soothing into the fault, but it had the words duty, seal, yardage, and pack thread descend through the ceiling with a soft, muffled clarity, each one detached momentarily from the blur before being reabsorbed into the ongoing drone, and the Fuller hears them as he might hear the distant call of a street vendor or the lowing of a cow in a far field. Sounds that are present, but not demanding, part of the broad, gentle noisescape of the afternoon. The other merchants, their own voices slowed by the weight of the meal and the warmth of the room, interject only occasionally. Their comments brief and low, and the general murmur that fills the Guildhall has a sleepy, comfortable quality. The sound of men who have been sitting together for many hours, and whose thoughts are beginning to turn toward the end of the meeting, and the walk home through the mild spring evening. The cloth in the vat has now felted to the point where the Fuller can feel its increased resistance through the soles of his feet, a springier, denser texture that pushes back against the board's cleats with a firm, resilient pressure, a texture that tells him the wool fibers have locked together into the thick, matted fabric that is the goal of the fulling, a fabric that will be warm and durable and ready for the shearman's cropping once it has been rinsed and dried on the tenter frame. This increased resistance is not a sudden change, but a gradual, cumulative development that has been progressing all day, and the Fuller registers it as a subtle, ongoing shift in the feel of the work, a shift that his feet have been tracking without any conscious thought, the way a sailor tracks the changing depth of water beneath a keel. The board's rocking has a slightly different quality now, a tighter, more controlled motion that reflects the cloth's increased density, and the liquid in the vat, which has grown cloudier and thicker over the hours with the dissolved grease and the loosened dirt, responds to each stomp with a deeper, more subdued glug, a sound that is less hollow than it was in the morning, as if the vat itself were growing fuller and more solid as the cloth nears its finished state. The Fuller wipes his forehead with the back of his hand, a gesture that he has made many times throughout the day, and that now comes with a slow, automatic regularity, his palm sweeping across his brow in a motion that catches the thin sheen of sweat and leaves his skin feeling cooler for a moment before the warmth of the vat reasserts itself. And he notices, in a distant, peripheral way, that his hand trembles very slightly when he holds it, before his face in quace. Kate, but in the morning sip of the best in the boy, get it, he rests his hand again on the overhead beam, the wood warm and smooth under his palm, and continues the stomping, with the same steady, patient beat, his feet lifting and falling in their slow, unchanging rhythm, the cloth compacting beneath him, the urine swirling and resettling, the afternoon wearing on toward its quiet, gradual close. The shadows on the wall, which had been climbing steadily since noon, now begin to lengthen downward as well, the angle of the sun shifting enough that the window's light no longer falls on the high plaster but begins to creep back down toward the floor, a slow, reversed migration that will eventually bring the light to rest on the flagstones near the door and then across the threshold, and then gone, the day draining out of the room as gently as it entered. The dust motes, which had been glowing in the golden shaft for hours, now begin to fade as the light weakens, their individual sparkles dimming until only the largest and slowest moving particles remain visible, and the cloud of suspended wool fibers and fine dirt that filled the middle of the room now recedes into a soft, hazy dimness, the air itself seeming to thicken as the afternoon draws on. The Fuller, who has watched this slow dimming many hundreds of times, feels it as a gentle, familiar pressure, a closing in of the walls that is not claustrophobic but comforting, the workshop wrapping itself around him like a blanket, being slowly drawn up toward the chin. He knows, without needing to count the hours or consult the guild's progress above, that there is still another stretch of work before the cloth can be lifted and rinsed, a stretch that might be an hour or might be slightly longer, and this knowledge does not trouble him because time in the vat is measured not by the clock, but by the feel of the wool underfoot, a feel that will tell him, with a certainty that needs no words, when the moment for the final turning has come and when the fulling is complete. He continues to stomp, his body moving in the same slow, automatic cadence, and his mind drifts on its quiet, wordless current, touching on nothing in particular, a mind that is empty in the way that a calm sky is empty, holding only the gentle, ongoing sensation of the work, the warmth, the rhythm, and the soft, muffled sounds of the guild's afternoon. Deliberation that roll through the ceiling like distant, amiable thunder. The scribe's voice has stopped its reading, And now the guildmaster speaks again, his deep, slow baritone outlining the schedule for the sealing of the next shipment, a routine announcement that draws a few low murmurs of assent and then subsides into a general, comfortable silence, the kind of silence that falls when men have discussed all they need to discuss and are simply waiting for the formal close of the meeting. The fuller hears this silence as a change in the texture of the sounds from above, a thinning of the background murmur that makes the stomping below seem suddenly louder and more present. The thump and lug filling the workshop with a renewed clarity, and he adjusts his pace by a tiny, unconscious fraction, slowing just slightly so that the rhythm matches the new, quieter mood of the building, a mood that speaks of endings, of the day's work drawing toward its natural conclusion. The sparrows in the eaves have fallen silent, perhaps dozing in the warmth of the sun-heated tiles, and the street outside has grown quieter as well, the morning's carts and vendors giving way to the slower, more intermittent sounds of the late afternoon, a single set of footsteps on the cobbles, a distant door closing, the faint, faraway cry of a child being called indoors. The fuller's body, which has been moving for so many hours that the motion has become as automatic as breathing, now carries a deep, bone-level fatigue that is not unpleasant, but is simply there, a heaviness that has settled into his hips and his lower back and the arches of his feet, and he knows that when the work is finally done and he steps down from the vat, his legs will feel strange and light, as if they belong to a different, less substantial body, a sensation that he has experienced at the end of every fulling day for 20 years. He will sit on the low bench by the door and let the air cool his wet skin, and he will drink the last of the ale from his clay cup, and he will listen to the guild members gathering their papers and their cloaks above, their footsteps heavy on the stairs as they descend into the street, and then the building will fall silent, and he will be alone with the vat and the dying light. But that moment is still ahead, still waiting on the other side of the final turning and the final hour of stomping, and for now there is only the continued, patient work, the thump and lug of the board in the amber liquid, the slow, steady compaction of the wool beneath his soles, the quiet golden fading of the afternoon that wraps the workshop in a gentle, deepening dusk. The Layet through des Meister de Sainten, the stacked of the Prostond. There's light to the afternoon's honeyed glow draining slowly from the room as the sun slips behind the rooftops of the cloth hall opposite, a descent that has taken the whole of the past hour, but has only now reached the point where the window's panes no longer hold indirect beam, just a diffused gentle radiance, Schattelfredi stem of the Kattelzeel but sentimental that kelted bubbity boltblaze. The fuller, who has been stomping for so long that his body has forgotten what stillness feels like, registers this change in the light through a slow, half-conscious awareness, a quiet signal that the day has entered its final chapter and that the work, like the light, is drawing toward its close, not with any suddenness, but with the same gentle, inevitable fade that has governed every other transition of this long, calm day. The guild meeting above has reached its concluding formalities, the guildmaster's voice now reading the minutes in a slow, measured monotone that lists the decisions taken and the penalties agreed, a voice that is deeper and slower than it was in the morning, heavy with the hours of talk and the weight of the afternoon's warmth, and around the long table the merchants shift on their benches with quiet, anticipatory creaks, the sounds of men who know that the end of the meeting is near and who are beginning to gather their belongings, straying to belay. The fuller hears these sounds as he has heard the sounds of the guild's gathering all day, as a familiar, comforting background that has accompanied his stomping since the early morning, and now, with the cloth nearly finished beneath his feet, the sound of the meeting's dissolution feels like a quiet, parallel ending, a second thread being tied off at the same moment as his own work reaches its natural completion. What? Against the mart of the mall fibers have fully matted, the grease completely dissolved, weave transformed from an open, loose grid of yarn into a thick felted fabric that is now dense and warm and ready for the rinsing trough, and he slows his stomping to browdo, tiny degrees, the thump in degrees, den krof, and he slows it spat famkin spade in the degol. The silence that follows is not sudden, but gentle. A quiet that has been waiting behind the rhythm all along and that now settles over the workshop like a soft, heavy blanket, filling the space where the heartbeat of the stomping had been, and leaving only the distant murmur from above, and the small ambient creaks of the building's timbers, and the faint, faraway cry of a gull over the river. The fuller stands on the top step of the wooden platform, his hand still resting on the overhead beam, and allows the stillness to wash over him, his body adjusting to the absence of motion, the way a swimmer adjusts to dry land after a long immersion, a strange, floating sensation in his legs where the rhythm used to be, a lightness that is not unpleasant but that feels unfamiliar after so many hours of steady, repetitive pressure. He flexes his toes against the board, feeling the softened, wrinkled skin of his soles and the slight, deep ache in his arches that speaks of the day's labor. And then he bends forward from the waist with the same slow, practiced motion he has used at every turning, reaching down into the warm amber liquid for the last time to find the edge of the cloth beneath the board. His fingers close around the corner of the fabric, which now feels thick and heavy and completely saturated, a dense felted mass that is many times heavier than the dry, raw wool he lowered into the vat that morning, and he begins to pull upward with a steady, patient force that brings the cloth rising out of the urine in a slow, dark cascade, the liquid streaming from the fabric in thick, amber rivulets that splash back into the vat with a soft, continuous patter, a sound that fills the quiet workshop like the last hög gentelt of main theoren. He har divinith, that is he, is en of us anoit, stent an agency for the filling any thin patch or loose thread that might cause the cloth to veil the guild's inspection, and he finds nothing but a uniform, dense matted surface that is the colour of wet earth, and the texture of in the strip. Wampen distenser so that set, and it is the duratus as a trout, and a setus it sells it a tell. He nods once, that same small private gesture that has punctuated the day's work at every stage, and then he turns and lowers the cloth onto the trestle table beside the vat, the wet fabric landing with a heavy sodden thump that sends a small shiver through the table's legs but makes no other sound, and the cloth lies there in a dark, steaming heap, its warmth rising into the cooling air of the workshop in thin, invisible curls that mingle with the last of the day's light. Now he steps down from the wooden platform, his bare feet finding the cold flagstones with a gentle, careful placement, and the sensation of the stone against his softened soles is sharp and bracing after so many hours in the warm vat, a contrast that wakes his body gently and reminds him that the work is done, that the stomping has ended, that the cloth is finished. He walks to the low bench by the door with a slow, slightly stiff gait, his knees creaking in the quiet room, and he sits down heavily on the wooden seat, his back against the cool plaster wall, his legs stretched out before him, his hands resting palms up on his thighs, the fingers still slightly curled from their long grip on the overhead beam. He sits there without moving for a while, letting the air dry the urine on his skin, a drying that leaves a faint, tightening film on his ankles and shins, a film that will wash away in the rinsing trough when he cleans the cloth, but that for now is simply a part of the work's residue, a small physical reminder of the day. The guild above has concluded its meeting, the guildmaster's voice falling silent after the final reading of the minutes, and now the merchants push back their chairs and collect their cloaks and their leather pouches, their footsteps moving toward the staircase in a slow, contented shuffle that is somehow heavier than their morning arrival, as if the day's discussions have added a small invisible weight to their shoulders, a weight that is not unpleasant, but that comes from the long hours of sitting and talking and concentrating on matters of cloth and trat. At right creak be it the keats. The footsteps descend the narrow turning staircase, the sound growing closer and louder as the men leave the guild hall and pass through the small landing that separates the upper floor from the workshop, and then the heavy door at the bottom of the stairs opens with a slow, low groan, and the first of the merchants steps out into the workshop, his face briefly visible in the dim, buttery light as he nods to the fuller with a small, absent gesture of farewell, a gesture that requires no words because the two men have earids, and no word that the aids have a recalcitrant. The other merchants follow one by one, their boots and shoes making soft, shuffling sounds on the flagstones as they cross the workshop toward the street door, their cloaks draped over their arms or pulled around their shoulders against the slight, cooling breeze that slips in through the open doorway, a breeze that carries the smell of the river and the damp stone of the lane, and the faint, distant smoke of evening, cooking fires, a smell that is different from the warm, ammoniated air of the workshop, and that signals the rechtwing findrainth. The Fuller watches them pass with a quiet, neutral gaze, his head resting against the plaster wall, and he lifts his hand in a small, slow wave that acknowledges their departure without requiring any of them to stop. A wave that is more a twitch of the fingers than a full gesture, and one or two of the merchants nod back, their faces already turning toward the thought of their homes and their suppers, their minds no longer on cloth or measures or seals, but on the small domestic comforts that await them beyond the narrow lane. When the last of the merchants has left and the street door has closed with its soft, heavy thud, the workshop falls into a deep, complete silence. The kind of silence that only comes when a space that has been full of sound and motion for many hours is suddenly empty. A silence that is not the absence of noise but a presence in itself. A thick, living quiet that fills the room from the flagstones to the ceiling beams, and that seems to ring faintly in the ears. A silence that the Fullers has heard. At the end of the he sits in this silence for a long, peaceful interval, his breathing slow and deep, his body gradually cooling as the warmth of the vat fades and the chill of the evening stone begins to seep up through the floor, and he listens to the small, settling sounds of the building, the tick of a beam contracting in the cooler air, the soft scratch of a mouse in the corner, the distant, muffled gurgle of the vat's liquid settling into absolute stillness after its long day of agitation. After a while, the Fuller rises from the bench with a low, quiet groan that is not pain but simply the sound of a body that has been still for a few minutes and is now returning to motion, and he walks to the trestle table where the finished cloth lies in its heavy, wet heap, the fabric now cooled to the temperature of the room and getting off only the faintest wisp of steam along its topmost folds. He places one hand on the cloth and feels its dense, solid weight, its thick, felted texture, and he experiences a quiet, wordless satisfaction that is too mild to be called pride, but that warms him somewhere deep in his chest, a small, steady glow of something completed, something made, something that did not exist in the morning, and that now does exist. And then he turns away from the cloth and walks to the peg where his apron hangs and his boots rest side by side, still lined up as he left them at the cenotart. And to the start of the day, he pulls on his woolen hose, unrolling them down over his calves with a slow, careful motion, the dry wool feeling rough and warm against his chilled, softened skin, and then he picks up his right boot and works his foot into it with a steady, patient pressure. The leather stiff from its day of rest, but soon warming to his foot's familiar shape, and he ties the thong with a simple, practiced knot that he has tied 10,000 times before. He repeats the process with his left boot, and then he stands, stamping his feet once on the flagstones to settle the leather into place. A small, final sound that echoes briefly in the quiet workshop and then fades. He takes his apron from the peg and folds it over his arm, a habit he has maintained since his apprenticeship when the old Fuller taught him to keep his tools and his apron clean and ready for the next day. And then he walks to the vat and pauses, looking down at the still amber surface of the urine, which now reflects the dim grey light from the window, with a dark wavering sheen, the cloth gone, the board removed, the liquid resting after its long day of work, and he places his hand on the bat's rim and gives it a small pat, a jedast at the Voldskin by a He walks to the street door, his boots making solid, patient sounds on the flagstones that are not so different from the sounds they made when he arrived that morning, and he pulls the door open with a slow, steady pull, the hinges groaning softly, the cool, damp air of the evening rushing in to meet him, carrying with it the smell of the river and the wet cobbles and the distant, earthy scent of the fields beyond the town wall. A smell that is fresh and clean and that washes the last of the ammonia from her nostrils, leaving the thought of the thanks while that's called. He is to me this bitch about the branch come into the way to my added sky and if I'm waiting would go against its rim and its rim, the finished cloth restal table waiting for the morning when it will be rinsed and stretched and dried, and then a pole the doors stood dried, unhunched on quarrel and bakel, and that the toad slime cordum and the bulk okled, and then in the now lane tilborough was skipper but coat the big gob of the body and the then of up to the back out of the out, but it's of Donner but